In this lesson, we're going to be dealing with the buttons on the microbit. There are two, button A and button B, and they're going to allow us to get input from the user, and then we're going to use that input to change what is on the display, which we covered in the last episode. So to start, as always, we're going to begin with the documentation, which is basically going to tell us everything we need to know. So we'll go to the table of contents, find the module that we're interested in this case buttons. When we go there, once again, we see an overview at the top, a list of the functions, what they do and how to use them, and also a nice little example. So how do we actually use the buttons? Well, when we start reading through the documentation, we can see that there's a class button with these three functions, which we're going to go through in a minute. But there's a slight subtlety here. First off, we don't ever actually use the class itself, the button, directly. Fortunately for us, two instances of the button class are made automatically. And those two instances are called button A and button B, which are the switches on the left and right hand side of the microbit. That's good because it means that we don't have to worry about creating those classes and we can use them straight away. So let's get going. To start off with, we're going to use the isPressed function, and that tells us essentially whether that button is currently pressed or not. So, as always, we'll start with a blank screen, and we'll begin by importing from the microbit API all of the functions. Again, we're going to do a block import just for simplicity. As always, we're going to use a infinite while loop so that the microbit keeps running on forever and ever and ever, which is a bit more interesting and more useful, especially when we're reading inputs from users, because most likely your input isn't going to press the button within the first couple of milliseconds that you run it. We need to continuously keep checking. And the program we're going to write then to start off with is when the button A is pressed, we show a smiley face. Otherwise, we're going to show a sad face. So for that, we're going to be using an if-else statement. So first off, we'll check whether button A is pushed. So we can see if we want to use button A, we have to use this attribute name, button_A. And we can access the functions associated with that class, which is a button class. Again, standard Python notation, just using a full stop, and the function name, in this case, is pressed. Okay, so if button A dot is pressed, then we want to display a happy face, as we covered in the last tutorial. Otherwise then, else, if the button isn't pressed, we want to display a sad face. Nice and simple. So if we upload that to the microbit, we should be able to see the following. So as I'm clicking button A, it turns to a smiley face, and when I'm not pushing it, it's a sad face. Next then, as an example, we'll now use button B just to show you how to do it. And this time we will show a happy face when we push button A and a sad face when we push button B. Otherwise, we'll just write a question mark. So for that kind of behavior, we're going to need an else if, and we will check whether button B is pushed. It should be pretty easy to guess the name of the class that we have to use, but if not, we can always go back to the documentation, just double check that and see that button B is exactly the correct name. So button B, the function is exactly the same. So this will check, query, whether that button is pushed, and if it is, we push a sad face. Else then, otherwise, if it's not pushed, we will just display a question mark. In the last lesson, we used display.scroll to show text. In this example, we're not going to do that. We're just going to use the show because we don't really want the question mark to scroll around. So if we upload that to the microbit then, when you push the button A on the left, you'll get happy. Button B on the right, you'll get sad. Otherwise, you'll get a question mark. And it should look like this. So So that's the basics of the buttons pretty much covered, but there's one other function which is quite interesting within the API, which is the get presses. If we read the description, this simply returns the number of times the button's been pressed since we last called get presses. So what we're going to do as a nice activity is we will automatically present the sad face, but then if you're pushing button A fast enough, the happy face shows. The way we can do that is by checking every second whether the number of presses exceeds a certain value. So if I push it 2 times in a second, then I'm not interested and I keep it sad. But if I've pushed it 4 times within a second, then I'm pushing it fast enough and we'll give the happy face. So let's do that. So we will create a variable called num presses, where we'll store the number of presses, and we're going to get from button A the number of presses that have been pushed, and that's with the get presses function. That's going to store it in the variable, and we can then do an if statement, say if num underscore presses is greater than, let's say, 3, then display show, and again it's going to be a happy face, else, so if we're not pushing the button fast enough, then we will do a sad face. And we want to do this check every, let's say 1 second, so we're going to go to sleep for 1000 milliseconds. So this code, as it's written, will sleep for 1000 milliseconds, then it will check the number of presses, and then it will present the correct image. What we might want to do, if we want to be really correct, is to actually chuck the sleep function at the beginning. And to be even more correct, what we probably also want to do is each time before we sleep for a second, reset the number of presses. How do we do that? Well, it's kind of in the detail of that get presses function, and we can read here in the API that it resets this total to 0 before returning, which basically means if we call it, it will store the number value and then it sets it to 0. So if we want to reset it, we'll simply call the function, but we won't store the value anywhere. So let's walk through this code then. We reset the number of presses to 0. We wait 1000 milliseconds, so a second. In the meantime, someone will be pushing the button. We then get the number of presses that that person has done within a second and store it in the variable. We then check, does it exceed a value? If it does, we show a happy face. If not, we show a sad face. So let's upload that to the microbit. And if you've got it correct, it should look something like this. So to start, I'm clicking slowly and we have a sad face. Then when I speed up the clicking, it becomes happy and it stays happy until I then start clicking slowly again. So there you have it. That's pretty much everything to do with the buttons covered. So watch out for the next tutorial where we'll move on to the GPIOs and start dealing with much more complex outputs and inputs.